My name is Nasser, and I am the head of strategy at DAC. I'm talking today about and I think one of the things that has really been highlighted to us as we have been progressing over the last few months is the central nature of digital to being able to work through and take advantage of the current situation that we all find ourselves in. What I think is less obvious is the nature of local digital experience and people's expectations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both those areas today. So the key takeaways I want you to take away from today's session, first of all, this idea of chaos. I stole this one line from Game of Thrones, but this idea that chaos is not a pit, it's a ladder. There's opportunity in chaos, there's change, there's churn that happens, and that if you make marketing investments right now, it doesn't just create an incremental advantage, it creates a generational advantage. And I'll show you the research that backs that up. The nature of these investments right now needs to be digital. So digital transformation really sits at the heart of all of these types of investments that are going to give you that type of generational advantage. And ultimately, the way that this all needs to play out is a connectivity of online and offline actions, particularly at the hyper-local level across an entire footprint. So let's get into this. I want to start us off with this. It's a famous quote. I'm not sure if there's an actual source for it, but this idea, this Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. It's supposed to be a curse because interesting times involves upheaval and change. And there's no question that we live in interesting times. And I think one thing that I wanted to provide some context for is, people look at the current situation around the pandemic and they're like, wow, there's so much change right now. But I want us to cast our minds back for context and to remember that there was enormous change even before the pandemic. So what does that change look like? And what is its impact? I want to give you also a little bit of research. So this is a famous piece of research done a few years ago, the Tellus and Tellus research. And what they did is they studied brands going right back to the Great Depression and to understand the impact of brands that increase investment in certain areas, advertising, marketing, during times of crisis. As the industry tends to retrench, as the industry tends to cut investment at these sorts of times, those brands that invested during every single crisis, and in fact increased their investments, were not only able to build in a minor advantage compared to their competitors, but they were able to build in generational advantages. So these advantages would last 10 to 15 years post-crisis. So I wanted you to have that as context to today's presentation. So if we think about chaos not as a pit, but as a ladder, and the type of change that we're all experiencing and were experiencing before, what are the main drivers of this change? The first driver was this idea of computational power being diffused into society. So what do we mean by that? It's a bit of a mouthful. We think about things like 5G networks coming, the explosion of bandwidth and data that's going to be available to us. So what does that imply? It implies the ability to access real-time data. It implies the acceleration of expectations. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if one brand suddenly takes advantage of this increase in computational capability and 5G networks and delivers exceptional experiences, that becomes the new benchmark for everybody else moving forward. This is going to lead to an increased demand for rich media and video. So think about the implications to the strategy, to the content that you build. It's not enough to just write the content. Now people are expecting things to be in video formats. Coupled with that is the rise of AI. So when we think about this is about the automation of complex tasks, the ability to analyze data far more rapidly and uncover previously unidentified opportunity. And then on the back of that, to deliver real-time experiences way faster than anything that we've been able to do to date. There's been a sea change in terms of the device selection and usage. So there's a lot of talk about mobile and the rise of mobile. Well, you know, we got there a couple of years ago. Now it's about voice. So one of the things that it leads to is rethinking how do people interact with technology? And as a result, what are the implications to brands around building content and building experiences that add utility and usefulness to people's lives on a day-to-day basis and lead them to being the selected, the chosen brand in that context? Another big change that's been happening for the last few months, in fact, going back a year, is this idea of connection activation of real-time data. So what does that mean? If you think about all the disparate data sources, not just web analytics and web data, but offline data as well. If you're able to connect these data sources, it's going to be able to provide contexts that you previously didn't have access to, which as a brand is going to be able to allow you increased relevance and being able to predict which experiences are going to lead to the types of increased and better outcomes that you care about as a business. One of the things that it's going to also imply is that as we think about building out digital experiences, they need to become omni-channel by default, because the lines between the offline and online environments are very much blurring. Now, on the back of that is there's heightened awareness around privacy and subsequent regulation of these types of experiences. So that's going to give us, as we have this flood of data that's coming to us on a daily basis, we have counteracting that increased restrictions on access to that data. So we think about things like the cookieless future that's emerging. We think about the implications to the platforms and potential government legislation to break up some of these gigantic monopolies. And one corollary of all of these sorts of things is the explosion in near me and accelerated expectations of unified experiences. So the implication here, and this is particularly important in the current environment that we find ourselves in a pandemic, where lockdowns and restrictions and spread of disease happens not at a national level or even at a regional level, but it's neighborhood by neighborhood, it's block by block. So as a brand that might be distributed across a wide network, you need to be able to communicate the different circumstances to the different audiences in each individual location. Think of yourselves not necessarily as a single brand with 1,000 locations, but as 1,000 different businesses in 1,000 distinct communities. So that's how we need to think based on how people are expecting us to respond right now. And we also see that people are looking for, particularly in the financial services business or industry, I should say, people are responding to all of the current crisis, the uncertainty, with increased demand, with increased appetite for financial services in their search behavior. So we see that search behavior on Google for financial help grew 200% over 1 week. At the beginning of the pandemic. Searches for apps in the finance category grew by 31%. We ask ourselves why? Well, if we are restricting people coming into physical locations, then people still have requirements that they need to fulfill other ways. And then there's also search interest for how to invest. That grew by 61%, which of course, when we think about all of the volatility in the investment markets, this shouldn't be a surprise. Now, what may be a surprise is how to leverage that. And I'm going to share with you an insight later on, specifically when it comes to investment and access and activation of real-time data. So we talked about this idea that investing right now, based on the Tellus and Tellus research, creates a generational advantage during crisis. Where should we be investing? This is a great pyramid around the elements of value that people look for during a pandemic like COVID-19. And it's from Bain, but I wanted to highlight 3 areas that they identify as being the most important things that people look for in these types of environments. They want you to help them reduce risk, reduce anxiety, and build affiliation and belonging. Why I think these are important, beyond the fact that it makes perfect sense during a pandemic to highlight these qualities, is that the way you highlight them is overwhelmingly local. It's about that local experience and the extension of it through digital messaging and communications. And I want you to also take this away, that this may seem counterintuitive, but since the start of the pandemic, we've seen an explosion in the importance of local channels as being the gateway to discovery for brands. So one of, or a number of our financial services clients, we saw that there was 15 times more traffic towards Google My Business listings than to the website experience itself. There is a huge shift in how people are discovering financial services content. And 76% of the people who conduct a local search on their smartphone visit the physical place within 24 hours. So they're looking for reassurance, they're looking for that sense of belonging, they're looking for the answers to their questions in those digital environments, and then they're completing whatever transactions or actions they want in the financial services space in the physical location. And 1 in 5 searches on Google are specifically related to location. So there is an absolute explosion of this interest right now, which again, feels counterintuitive based on you sitting there saying, well, hold on, would I want to visit a physical location? Would I want to visit a branch? The answer is still yes, they do, but under very specific circumstances. And if you can give them the types of reassurance that they want around safety and security and reassurance and so on. So when we think about this idea of these types of investments we would recommend making in order to build out that generational change, digital transformation is very much at the heart of this. We know that the future of banking is digital. We know that 81% of financial consumers want additional digital features and would find them useful. Now, when we think about digital features, especially in the local context, this goes well beyond name, address, phone number. We're thinking about ratings and reviews. We're thinking about safety protocols, cleanliness, hygiene, all of these kinds of things. Being able to book an appointment, being able to transact through entirely digital environments, so e-commerce and so on. All of this devolves back to, if we say that there is an explosion in traffic through things like Google My Business listings, what are we doing to enrich that environment with all of these digital calls to action or digital enhancements that people are looking for in that channel, as opposed to rely entirely on that channel just to relay hours of operation and invite people into a web experience that then is designed to answer all of these questions. And I think one of the reasons why this is such a critical time is that if we think about millennials being a core audience, a really interesting thing has happened with this audience, and it's carried through and been amplified and accelerated by the pandemic. This audience are way more likely to switch primary banks than Gen X or boomers. And what we found in the pandemic, in fact, we don't have this stat right here, but people were have become 40% more likely to consider a new brand, regardless of whether it's banking or financial services or what have you, or well beyond, but are much more willing to switch brands today at this time of disruption than they have been at any time previously. So brands that respond to the kinds of things that people are looking for right now are able to build in that advantage. So when we think about the types of ways that we would recommend that brands respond, the core consideration is this connectivity of online and offline actions. So what are the investments that are needed to ensure that? The first is this idea of a need for more resilient systems. Simply put, our systems, our back-end systems for digital fulfillment in North America are just not up to par. I recall reading studies at the start of the pandemic when it was exploding in China, how in Wuhan they were able to build on the infrastructure, the e-commerce infrastructure that they had in place so quickly that you could order something online and have it at your door in 10 minutes. This was about 2 weeks into the pandemic, whereas here in North America, we are so behind in terms of the back-end systems for digital fulfillment that any brand that is able to make those investments is able to leap ahead of their competition. So really seriously look at the back end on the fulfillment side of your digital experiences. There's a real opportunity right now to take advantage through rapidly scaling investments in real-time data and insights. So this is a really significant chart. It goes back a couple of months to the height of the pandemic, first wave, I should say. And what you're seeing here is this is around the time of the original lockdown in the US. And there was a crash in terms of the stock market. And what ended up happening is around the time that all of this was crashing, look at the gigantic spike in interest in buying stocks. So this feels counterintuitive. You say, well, hold on a second. If everybody is selling, I, as a financial institution, should retrench. Actually, no, that's the time to invest. And the smart investors understand how that works. So these types of insights are available to you, but you need to make investments and then be able to pivot your business based on what the data is actually telling you about what consumers are looking for in order to get ahead of the marketplace. And then another consideration is this idea of a more conscious capitalism. So people are actively, at times of crisis, looking for messaging that is less about me and more about we. So, you know, this is an example for content for National Bank. But I really want you to think about how you can shape your messaging to really highlight that, you know, you're fulfilling on that promise, that idea that we're all in this together. Everybody keeps saying that. People are increasingly jaded about that message. So what are you doing in terms of the content experiences, especially at the local level, to reinforce your support for local communities? And then I want to highlight that, you know, this is not an academic exercise. This has real implications in terms of real world impact on the business. So I wanted to highlight a number of different sectors here and the impact that we've seen for our clients during the pandemic on their business. So in the retail sector, which has been absolutely walloped by the pandemic, our clients, or a number of clients on an average basis, have seen their e-commerce revenue almost double over last year. In the automotive sector, again, a doubling on return on ad spend. Why? Because a lot of competitors were pulling back. It became a lot cheaper. In the healthcare space, being able to increase and double the lead volume at 63% less cost per lead. And then in the insurance space, 180% growth in lead volume versus last year on a flat budget by putting in place the types of recommendations I outlined. So in summary, we know that change was already happening at a breakneck pace, and a lot of financial institutions, particularly in Canada, North America, were having a lot of difficulty in keeping up. COVID has disrupted and accelerated this change. It hasn't created necessarily a new dynamic. It's just poured gasoline on the fire and made far greater demands of businesses in order to transform in a much, much shortened period of time. And our responses as businesses in the next few months will define our outcomes for years to come and allow us to build a generational advantage, or if we do nothing, a generational disadvantage. So thank you very much for your time today. That's the end of my presentation.